I'm excited to have with me my friend Dr. David Capes from the Lanier Library in Texas. We've been friends for a long time, worked on some boards together. We're collaborating on some writing projects together. I'm starting an exciting new series talking through some material from my book, 50 New Testament Words of Life with Zondervan Academic. I wanted a chance to talk with real experts. I do my best, but I want to talk with real experts like Dr. David here about each book of the New Testament that I talk about in my book, and some of the themes from these 15 New Testament words. So actually, I'm here today
Mm.
to talk with David about the Gospel of Matthew. He's doing some work on Matthew, and especially the theme of righteousness. And we're going to get into eventually what that means for real life today. So, David, I've introduced you a little bit, but I know you started out your career, I think, as a Paul guy.
Yeah, I did more Paul stuff,
And then
early
you
on.
you know you kind of go back and forth, but now you're doing more and more gospels. I know you're teaching gospels. What's some of the stuff you're working on in the I remember you did a great book on I think it's called Rediscovering Jesus.
Rediscovering Jesus. Yeah, I'm using
That's
that
right.
right now as a textbook. I co-authored that, so I should,
Co-authored it. Yeah.
yeah, but it was a fun book to do, and where we compared the various gospels and
I thought that
and
was
and
great.
Paul's Jesus and that kind of thing
Hollywood,
over against Hollywood's Jesus,
Mormon
and
Jesus.
the
Yeah.
Mormon
Yeah.
Jesus and the Gnostic Jesus and the Muslim Jesus. Jesus figures really highly in Islam, as you may
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So we wanted to kind of do a book that talked about those things because most of us are going to have Muslim neighbors, maybe, or
Yeah.
Mormon neighbors. So that would help us talk about these things well. But doing that, but I did a lot of stuff on Paul and Paul's Christology early on,
Yeah.
and have just loved Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel and all the gospels really. But you just kind of settle in on one and you start working
You
on
do.
it, and you just say, "Oh, I love this stuff." So,
So you're working on something on Matthew. What are some things you're doing on Matthew?
well, I finished a book a while back called Matthew Through Old Testament Eyes,
That's
and
right.
in
That's right.
that book, I asked the question. The big question was, if we really knew the Old Testament well, how would we read Matthew differently? And but because I think for the author of Matthew and for the people that first received it, they probably knew the Old Testament better than we do, right? We know some stories, we know some textures here and there, but we don't often know some of the real details, the kind of things that people would dig into in those days. So that was kind of pressed the interest of that book.
And you're working on some new stuff.
Working on a book now with you, actually, the Bible in God's World, and
I'm looking
Scott
forward to
as
that.
well. Yeah, working in Matthew still, and I'm teaching a course in South Africa soon at George Whitfield College in Cape Town on Matthew. So doing a lot of Matthew these days, and I'm loving it.
Well, speaking of Matthew, before we get into the words of life, I want to just ask you a little bit. I know, since you've done some writing on Matthew, you're probably prepared to think through some of the typical background introductory questions. So,
Hmm.
um, can you tell us anything about who is the writer of the first gospel? What can you say about that you feel like you can stand behind?
Yeah. Well, there are people that say, begin by saying, well, the gospel is anonymous. There's the Matthew's not mentioned, doesn't mention his name. Simon Gathercole's made a really interesting, I guess in an article, made a really interesting argument saying that just because a person's name was not in the book doesn't mean that they were anonymous to the first readers, that they would have been known. And there were all sorts of ways in ancient world that authors could be attached. And it wasn't true at the time that in writing histories that most writers didn't put themselves in the story, but it just became known. We know that early on, that in some of the earliest manuscripts that we have of Matthew, that the title Kata Matthaion, according to Matthew, is there. And of course, the tradition is very strong through Papias and through Irenaeus and some others that it was associated with one of the 12, one of the followers of Jesus. I think there's fairly good reason to continue to think that a traditional authorship of that gospel is likely. And I would make the case that writing anything in the ancient world was not really a solo act. It wasn't just a guy sitting down at a desk writing out what he remembered about Jesus. It was much more networked than that. There were co-authors, there were secretaries, there were other people involved. And in some cases, the case has been made, and probably right, that Matthew used Mark, as kind of a background for it, as kind of the structure of it, and then but gave his own theology. He himself theologized through the life of Jesus, based upon his experiences of Jesus, based upon the early church, and based upon, I think, probably the needs of his community. So I continue to say, yeah, Matthew's the author of the book. And I think there's fairly good reasons for holding on to that, both in terms of how books like Gospels were written, biographies and such, but also how people would have known who the writer is. I told my students not long ago, if you take the cover, in fact, I don't know about your book, but if you take the cover and first few pages off of your book, I'm not sure who would know, if they would know who wrote your book, right? Because you probably didn't say, well, I need Jay Gupta say this in my book. It's on the cover page, it's on the cover, and pretty much after that, we try to disappear, right? In a way. We're just writing.
That's right.
So I think that's similar to what the writers of the Gospels are doing. They're doing a biography of Jesus, but it's a theological biography, and it's one that is designed to proclaim the gospel and to be there as an assurance of things that people may already know about Jesus in some cases, but didn't always know. Some of it is new to them.
So you mentioned Mark already, and raised the question of ordering, priority, sources. Most scholars today follow the assumption that Mark is first. They call it Mark in priority, and that Matthew is using Mark, like you said, as some kind of basic outline. So in your opinion, what is distinctive about the Gospel of Matthew? There are a lot of similarities between Matthew and Mark, but obviously Matthew is much, much longer.
Yeah.
And Matthew was motivated to, I remember, Francis Watson saying, when you have someone like Matthew come along, they're not saying, hey, have both these books in your library. They're saying, I'm the better version of the gospel. I don't know if I would go that far, but there's that question of what was Matthew trying to do to improve upon or put his own theological stamp on the story of Jesus?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things about that. Gosh, where do you get started? I mean, the very beginning of the book is the account of in some translations say the genealogy. I think that's a misreading. I think it's the Genesis, the origin of Jesus, right? This entire book is about how Jesus and his life began. It's the genesis of Jesus. And so from the very beginning all the way through, I think there are these Old Testament sort of references and echoes, to use Richard Hayes's language, and allusions that we don't find in Mark, but that would be very appealing and interesting and probably persuasive to a Jewish audience at the time. So, I mean, we begin with the genealogy of Jesus. That's unique. I mean, here, I mean, the way it's situated, the way it's ordered, the little annotations in it are doing some really interesting things. I remember reading the Bible through, EJ, when I was a kid, and I would always get to the genealogies of Jesus, and I would just skip right over that. I didn't care about that stuff.
I won't tell anybody.
But I would do that. And I know people that have done that, but there's some really incredible stuff at the very beginning here that is going to signal the kind of Messiah Jesus is going to be, the kind of community he's going to build. I mean, he includes women in the genealogy, which is incredible, right? Which is just signaling that in this kingdom of God, women are going to have a unique place. They're not going to be second-class citizens or deficient males or whatever. They're going to be really key. And there are a lot of Gentiles sort of that are included as well, which is, again, hinting to the back of the book where Jesus says, go into the nations and make disciples of all the nations and teaching them and such. So I think those are just some things that you can begin with. And then you've got all these connections of Jesus and teaching. Yeah, Jesus is so this master teacher.
Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount is as I think Oscar Brooks used to say, it's the inaugural address of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
It's just the first thing out of the box. He has this 3-chapter, beautiful, elegant sermon that as Matthew has sort of seen it, and Jesus is doing all this wonderful teaching. So that's unique. I mean, we don't find that. In Mark, Jesus is more of a miracle worker. There are some teachings of Jesus, but it's really concentrated in Matthew. And I think he's trying to signal that Jesus is the teacher, just like Moses was the teacher of Israel. And Jesus is the prophet and the teacher of Israel now in this day. So I think there are some really incredible things, a lot of things about fulfillment of scripture here in Matthew, some creative readings of text.
Yeah.
It's not always a prophecy that is a prediction that comes true. In some cases it is, but in some cases it's much more evocative and interesting and connecting the Old Testament to the New, how God has worked in the past. Now we see how he's working in the life of Jesus. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on.
Yeah, no, I've heard that explained is why Matthew is placed at the beginning of the canon of the New Testament portion of the canon as a bridge, obviously, between old and new, just like that scribe, the wise scribe is able to bring treasure old and new.
Yeah.
In many ways, Matthew is doing that. Patrick Schreiner has written on some of that, helpful bridging kind of stuff. Well, that's a good lead in, especially on the teaching of Jesus, to the subject of righteousness, which, I focused my first chapter of my book on the word righteousness because Matthew is really interested in righteousness in a way that's not true of Mark or John. Luke is also interested. But I just pulled out some statistics here. Mark uses dikaiosune 2 times. I think dikaios at all. He uses that word group 2 times. John 5 times. Matthew more than 20.
Yeah.
Now, even if you take into account Mark is much shorter, John is approximately the same length as Matthew. 5 verses 23, 5 verses 25. Matthew's 5 times more interested in righteousness than John. It's not that John isn't interested. He uses different language for this sort of thing. It's hard to think of righteousness in the abstract, so I'm going to give you a text that I would love for you to spitball with me about. This is good for your commentary work, David. Good. You're going to have to answer to this, so you might as well do it now.
I'm going to be referring to this podcast in the.
I'll send you a transcription.
Good.
Okay, so 2 texts, and you can tell me how you would, kind of give me your take on how you would paraphrase this or explain it. So in Matthew, Jesus is getting baptized. Matthew 3, she's getting baptized by John, and John thinks it's a trick. He says, no, you're the Messiah. And Jesus says, let it be so now, for it's proper for us in this way too. And you know how this ends, fulfill all righteousness. And then he consented. I've opened up a bunch of commentaries and nobody understands this.
Nobody likes to comment on this because
nobody likes to comment out. I'll give you another text and you can kind of combo these.
Okay.
Jesus is giving the Beatitudes, chapter 5. This is verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Clearly, according to Matthew, Jesus is really concerned with righteousness. Tell me what it is and why Jesus is so concerned with it.
Well, I think one of the things when we think about the teaching of Jesus, and one of the things you bring about in your book is that theology is about living, right? Theology isn't about speculating and just rummaging around in your mind. It's about living. And so I think the Sermon on the Mount is incredibly interested in living.
Yes.
So starting with the second one first, I see it as an ethical word in some sense, right? It's about what you do. It's not about do you believe the right stuff. It's about what you do. And so the way I've typically paraphrased the idea of righteousness is, and it's similar to what you've said, is doing the right thing for the right reason.
I like that.
When we do the right thing, now God is the one who determines what the right thing is. We don't determine. It's not a majority vote. It's not something about personal, and so that ties us into God's teaching, right? God's law. I have a hard time thinking of righteousness separate from God's teaching in the Old Testament or Jesus's teaching in the New Testament. So when we do the right thing, we have already been in tune with God, because we've been listening to God teach in the Hebrew scriptures. We've been listening to God teach, Christ teach, as the one who embodies the God of Israel in the New Testament. And so that sets the tone, that sets the angle for what righteousness is, what right is. And then I think it speaks to our motive as well, because later on Jesus talks about, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never see the kingdom, I think was the language there. So I think it goes to the issue of motive. What's in the heart? Mm-hmm. Not just have you done the right act, but have you done it for the right reason? And again, I think we're thrown back into the teaching of God at that point, because being in this covenant with God, this relationship with God, provides that motive, provides the right motive for the right action.
All right, let's say, I don't know if you ever played the game Taboo, but it's this game where you have to get someone to say a word, but you can't say certain words related to it. So let's say I made the English word righteousness taboo and you couldn't say it.
Oh, gosh.
How would you translate, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for...
Oh, gosh. You didn't tell me you were going to do this.
I'm stumping you. I'm stumping you.
It's hard.
I want to break down the Christianese here, David. Help me.
Okay. All right.
You can use a few synonyms. You can use a phrase if you want.
I mean, I would say those who hunger and thirst desire for what is good.
Yeah.
Ultimately the good. Yeah. And you could tie this all the way back to Genesis, when creation is good, very good, etc. There is a good that we can pursue.
Yeah.
And I think the good life, the good community, the good society, all of those things could be, in a way, synonyms for this, right? I don't know.
I like that.
That would be.
That reminds me of when we call God good. We're not saying he's delicious. We're not saying he's beautiful, even though he is. We're really saying he's righteous. He's perfect. He's trustworthy. We're kind of. I like that. We're kind of using those things. You had mentioned. This is another stumper. You mentioned the Pharisees and the scribes, and in Matthew 5:20, Jesus says, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is another one that scholars do not like to come down on, because it sounds like a quantity, like you have to get to 50 points or 100 points. I don't think Jesus is saying that, because in Matthew, Jesus is very critical of the scribes and Pharisees, so he's not really wanting more of what they're doing necessarily. So what do you think he means when he says your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, or you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven?
A part of that, Nijay, is I imagine myself in the audience that day.
Yeah.
If I had been there with Jesus and Jesus said, your righteousness must exceed there. And I can just sort of imagine hitting my head and said, how in the world is that possible? I mean, because these are the most righteous people, the right people, the good people, they're the best of the best. So I think that for the people who are there, they could not sort of imagine what that was about. And I think that's why Jesus goes in to begin illustrating what this greater righteousness would look like. It's not really a quantity of it. It's really peeling back the onion to saying, it's not just the action, but it is the motive behind the action. It's the heart, etc. So when he talks about murder, the thing that leads to murder, the anger that leads to murder, he really probes the question of anger, what's in the heart. The Pharisees could probably say, hey, me, I've never murdered anybody, raise their hand and been proud of it. But could they have stayed quite so proud? And the moment went, well, what about anger? Have you never not gotten angry at anybody? Have you ever not called somebody names in the middle of anger or whatever? And the same thing with lust and such as well. It's not just a matter of have you committed the act, but what about entertaining those thoughts in your mind that would one day could lead to an act, but it still is a moment of unpeace, unshalom, right, in a person's life. So
I like how
yeah,
you're tying that directly to Matthew. So it's not so much uh, a very specific quantity as much as maybe deeper, you might say deeper righteousness.
yeah, yeah. I
That
like
might be a
that.
better way
Yeah.
to capture that.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think that's why you have those, and I don't think that they're not really antitheses, but they're often called antitheses. I think that's why you have the examples that Jesus gives, because he's really trying to go deeper into a person's life than just the outward act itself.
when when Jesus says, "Strive for the kingdom of God and His righteousness," and all these other things like your well-being and food and clothing will follow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we take enough time to stop and say, what does it mean to seek the kingdom's righteousness or the king's righteousness? How would you explain that in a sermon?
Mm-hmm.
How would you explain that to your students? Strive, seek, pursue. How do you
Yeah.
pursue a king's righteousness? What does that mean?
Well, part of what I'd do is I'd peel it back and say, where's the Old Testament language looks like? And there's a passage in Deuteronomy. I don't remember the chapter and verse exactly, but it says, "Justice, justice shall you pursue."
Yeah,
And there's this repetition,
parallel.
and in Hebrew, when you have repetition, usually that means emphasis, right?
Yeah,
So I would have to probably wrap in here a bit of talk about what justice is, because justice and righteousness are really two sides of the same coin in
mm-hmm.
a sense. But there is the idea of the king's righteousness, pursue his righteousness. And I would actually go back to the passage where we've started at the baptism of Jesus, where it said we got to fulfill all righteousness.
Yeah, you didn't answer that one yet.
I would take that as sort of jumping forward or jumping backward to God's being right in the past and making his people right and saving them and redeeming them, but also moving forward to the future to what Jesus was about to do on the cross, right? And that the idea of his righteousness at that point is fulfilling all that God has been doing, working together toward all that God has been doing in the past. And it's probably overused, but joining God in his righteousness, and that is not just a passive thing. That would be an active thing. That's what striving is about. We don't strive while we're sitting on the sofa, watching Netflix or something. Striving involves action and activity, striving for justice, striving for the kingdom. It's not that it's unattainable or that you can't know if you've attained it. It's just a different disposition than, okay, I'm just here to receive a gift, right?
Yeah.
I think it is a gift, but at the same time, we've got to understand that gift within the context of all that God has been doing. God has been faithful all these years to his people and to his creation. And I think that fulfilling all righteousness, Jesus just puts himself at that moment. Well, what I'm doing now is joining God and fulfilling what God had all along meant all along for me in my life. And so Jesus's life and his baptism becomes the example for what our baptism is supposed to be, right? I know we take Protestants, we take Romans 6 and places like that, Paul's version of that, but in most baptistries I have seen where it's immersion and there's a painting or a mural on the wall, you're in the Jordan River, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they have painted the Jordan River
They
on
have
the wall
Jesus
behind
there.
it.
Yeah.
They have Jesus there, right? So it's a reminder that when you're baptized, when you enter into baptism, when you enter into this covenant, you are entering into what Jesus has already inaugurated, what he's already begun.
So, I can't remember the last time I heard a sermon on righteousness. But this is so important across the Bible, as you've talked about. It's important in the Old Testament, right wising or right making activity of God, covenant faithfulness. the pursuit of justice, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. It's important in Matthew.
Mhm.
What message do you think the church and modern Christians today need to hear about dikaiosune, which is the Greek word for righteousness? We could translate justice. I like integrity, honesty.
Mhm.
You've used
Mhm.
language of goodness. Where does your mind go as you're thinking about, okay, thinking about people's life, not just on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday? What does what the Bible has to say about righteousness speak to their everyday, what we think of as boring or mundane lives?
Yeah. Boy, I would long to be bored, honestly. I don't remember the last time I was bored. But I mean, to me, life can be so incredibly exciting. Um, but there are those sort of everyday things. And I see Sunday, because being in the ministry, you see Sunday as kind of a work day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's you're fully engaged normally that time. But I just see everything that's in Matthew is sort of pointing back to the life of the body,
Mm-hmm.
the life of the mind. Um, this is not salvation. When it talks about salvation, it's not as Wright, N.T. Wright and others have said, it's not about just uh, stamping your ticket to heaven. It's about transforming yourself in this life. And so I like the word that you use in the book. I think in just a moment ago, integrity.
Mm-hmm.
That our lives on Monday look like our lives on Sunday. That there should not really be any difference between those. So that if we are prayerful people on Sunday, we should be prayerful people through the week, right?
Yeah.
Not just on Sunday. And I know that there are concentrated moments in worship and prayer and those kind of things on Sunday, but those are the practices that will inform us, right? The practice of prayer. And Matthew, I mean, I love chapter 6, because beware of practicing your righteousness in front of others so that you'll receive credit from them, right?
Right. Performance.
The way I've sort of put it is do righteousness for God's eyes only,
That's right.
right? It's just really for God's eyes. We don't do it because you're looking or somebody else is looking or somebody's taking note. We do it as an offering to God. So we give to the poor. We fast occasionally. We pray consistently, and we often pray, quote, the Lord's Prayer. So those things are the practices that should shape us, I think. And then all the teachings of Jesus throughout the gospel on discipleship are just brilliant ways of just bringing us back to a relationship, a connection to there. And I find that to be really helpful to think of it in those terms. And it doesn't mean that there aren't some mundane times and there aren't some troubled times, because there are. I mean, you know my life story of late about how we lost our middle son 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we have agonized in that, through that. We still do that. We liturgize aspects of mourning him,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll always do that. But that's just part of what happens in life. So we've asked ourselves many times, what does it mean to be righteous and yet be, in a sense, angry with God, frustrated with God over the fact that your adult son is not with you anymore, and you lose all that stuff. So that's the real stuff of life. People are losing their jobs and have lost jobs.
Yeah.
People have had COVID. I can't tell you
Sickness.
how many people I know that I've talked to recently who've had friends and family that have died in COVID. It at any rate, it's I think we have to sort of deal with what righteousness is, what rightness is, what doing the right thing in each and every situation is, and doing so from that pure heart, doing so from a good heart, or um, doing so from a heart and a life that is lived with integrity, so that Monday looks like Saturday, it looks like Wednesday, it looks like Thursday.
Yeah, as you're talking, it reminds me, in the news, pretty much on a constant basis now, we're seeing mega churches, large churches embroiled in scandals, sexual, financial, um,
Yeah.
uh, spiritual abuse, power issues. I can't help but connect this to righteousness,
Yeah.
because Jesus is so often talking about integrity, authenticity, transparency,
Mm-hmm.
humility.
You're exactly right.
Can you give me your, quick diagnostic? What's going on? I mean, this is kind
Yeah.
of a reckoning, I feel like, all over the place, especially in the American church. We're seeing a reckoning where we have this ability to communicate through the internet, widespread, share stories, and now we're starting to uncover some of these things. This is a righteousness issue, but
It is a righteousness
what's your
issue.
take on what's going on right now with the church?
Yeah. We've had kind of a little bit of a love affair with mega churches and all that they're able to accomplish and be, and the reputations and such. One of the things I try to help students to remember is that, at least in the United States, most churches are less than 100 people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and those are rural churches, city churches, et cetera. So the people that you train and I train, not everybody's going to be a mega church pastor, right? And in part, I see sort of that waning now because of these integrity issues. People getting into positions of power and abusing that power. This is a very human story,
Mhm.
right? We might be quote saved, to use the Baptist language. We might be going to heaven. We might be this and that and the other, but we still have a nature that we have to deal with, a nature that is proud, that wants to see its advantage, wants to take control, that kind of things. And I've dealt with people like that all my life. I mean, both in colleges and churches as well. And it's very disappointing. We've got to figure out a way. And sometimes churches can be staffed in such a way, or have elder boards in such a way, that they really do keep the mega church pastor in check, that this person is truly accountable to a group of people and truly listens to them and will change his or her behavior as a result of that. But when they're sort of given carte blanche, when people say, "I'm afraid of losing him because all these churches want him or want her," those kind of things, those are just dangerous moments for the church, because at any moment we ought to be able to let go of these people, and still be the church and not really be dependent upon their talent, their drive, their ambition, that kind of thing. So I try to remind my students that you're not going to be a mega church pastor, 99.99% of you. Those of you who do, boy, you have got this greater, or you have a great, not necessarily greater, but you have a great responsibility. And so I really call on elder boards and deacon boards and staff to hold their pastors and church leaders accountable when behavior gets out of line, whether it's an issue of power or fiscal or money or whatever it is. One of the things that I think is big trouble, NJ, and I've been talking to a friend about this, is that very often in these mega churches, the budgets are invisible. I mean, people are, and particularly the element of the budget of salaries. And part of that is because they don't want people to know that the pastor makes 4 times what the average church member makes, right?
That's the
And I understand that.
transparency issue.
That's a transparency issue. I think we ought to be putting our salaries out there, every sort of jot and tittle, so that they can be scrutinized and criticized. And there are going to be some critics out there that won't, but by and large, I think we're better off if we, in a sense, let people know we are people of integrity all the time. And that includes letting where's the money going, right? Where's the money going, and how does that work? So I think it's a question of money, a question of power. I mean, these things are ancient. We have new technology today. We've got great toys. I mean, we're talking on Zoom, and it's a great toy, great tool. But at the same time, the lack of humility, the desire for power, those are ancient. They've been with humanity. And that's why the Bible's so relevant.
That's right.
Because it speaks to
Amen
those
to that.
things, right? I mean, as human beings, fundamentally, we're no different than we were 10,000 years ago in terms of these kinds of things. So I think that's why the ethical part of the scriptures, this righteousness, this integrity, this honesty, this fundamental goodness is so crucial for our church leaders.
Well, as you know, Matthew very early became the most popular gospel and perhaps the most popular New Testament text in those first few centuries.
Hmm.
I think because of the very long teaching blocks on the Christian life. As you know, the early church, when they catechized believers, they used three tools to teach the Christian way. They used the Ten Commandments to teach morality. They used the Lord's Prayer from Matthew to teach religion, and they used the Apostles' Creed to teach theology. And Matthew, you know, kind of became this kind of mascot or chief of texts because of how much, you know, we might say red letters, you know, is in the Gospel of Matthew. Well, let's
Yeah.
end on a positive note as we wrap up.
Sure.
What's giving you hope and encouraging you these days?
Um, uh, Despite what I was saying earlier, you know, about concerns about megachurches, I am more hopeful now about the people of God than I've been. I've just seen some remarkable examples of righteousness, of integrity,
Hmm.
of love, um, and these are hard times to express those realities. We're living in very polarizing times, and so I'm very hopeful about the people of God.
Mm.
And I'm not hopeful for, you know, talk about hope. We talked about hope on another podcast about the long, you know, 1,000 years from now. I'm hopeful for tomorrow
Yeah.
about what God's people are up to and what they're doing. It's really exciting. People can both disappoint us, but they can also thrill us. And so I'm excited about the people of God and excited about what we're doing here at the Linear Theological Library, of course,
Yeah.
and all the different work aspects and the new place we have over in Oxford that we're establishing. So a lot of great things going on here.
Great. Well, thank you, David, so much for your time. I encourage anyone watching or listening to check out David's book, Matthew Through Old Testament Eyes, or is it Gospel of Matthew, perhaps through Old Testament eyes.
Yeah,
And
Matthew, the Old Testament.
he's working on a commentary on Matthew, which I'll might be editing, so I'll get a chance to see that before anybody. I'm excited about that. Thank you so much, David, for your time.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Nijay. Blessings, and thanks for the great book, 15 New Testament Words of Life. It's a great book.